Well, the latest news just came out hot off the press. The Trump administration is revoking the visa of Brazil's ambassador to the United States, demanding a series of things. Yes?
Ours. When we look at this process, what we essentially have to see, right, is the pattern of interference, right? Look, let's set the record straight about everything that's happening. The first fact we have is that there's a diplomatic practice that's mandatory, right? How does it work? It's called agreement, or in Portuguese, concordância. What does that mean? Look, just so you have an idea of what this means, not even Israel disrespected this. Not even Israel. You ask the other country if this person is accepted as ambassador. Why is that? Because the figure of the ambassador is absolutely untouchable. He is the symbol of the other country. So you need, the request for agreement means the following. This country, this person for us is the United States. This person for us is Germany. This person, and so on. So it's agreement. It's an agreement. An agreement that person is relevant, with which Brazil commits to that person's personal security. Everything about this person guaranteeing all their rights, right? It's a two-way street. They offer this guarantee, they offer this acceptance, and on the other hand, there are guarantees. What is the diplomatic practice? Through diplomatic channels, that is, quietly, right? The name is suggested to the ambassador to the Brazilian embassy, which sends it to Itamaraty. And this is standard practice for everyone. Brazil follows the same procedure. None of that was done. First, the United States announced the ambassador a month ago, and now they've asked for approval. In other words, they broke the bureaucratic rule about the United States itself. Pay attention to that. I just checked to see if there was any information, right? If there was something wrong with my memory. The ambassador was approved in a 13-8 vote by the Foreign Relations Committee of the American Congress, of the U.S. Senate, which is the one that approves. I didn't mean Congress, that's wrong, it's the Senate, which is the one that approves, right? The first step, approves what, right? We are going to send this name. It's a confirmation hearing just like here. A confirmation hearing is held, by the way. Daniel Perez was especially sympathetic to Brazilian interests. That has to be noted. So this hearing, and then he sends it to the floor. Pay attention to this, because he definitely did not go along with Trump's haste. He didn't vote. Attention, in the U.S. Senate chamber, Trump has a majority of 53-47. That sends a message, right? Officially, he's not the ambassador to Brazil. He's not appointed because the Senate didn't approve it. There's an urgency in this process that's inexplicable, Cesar. First, the agreement wasn't requested, breaking the bureaucratic rules. Second, the U.S. Senate didn't approve it. Third, the cancellation of the Brazilian ambassador's wife's visa is an absolutely unprecedented measure in 203 years of relations. This has never happened in the relationship with the United States. The question we always have to ask is the same. Why is this happening? Maybe we have to focus this answer, obviously, on Marco Rubio, who may be feeling a disapproval, a censure in the U.S. Senate regarding his nominee. On one hand. On the other hand, he feels that the efforts to support the candidacy he endorses are not being efficient enough. So he takes another step to draw a little more attention. So it's clear, and with this he intends, there's no other word for it, right? There's a sense of blackmail. If you grant the agreement without the Senate's approval, if you grant the agreement quickly, we will cancel the cancellation of the Brazilian ambassador's wife's visa. This haste can be understood as inefficiency due to pressures for the benefit of a certain candidacy, and it can also be understood as the efficiency of professional Brazilian diplomacy. They don't know what to do with this efficiency. We are not familiar with it, I'll repeat. We are not familiar with this efficiency. We don't know how much Brazil's foreign ministry is acting within American society. Notice the number of Democratic representatives who made very strong statements in support of Brazil. That means something, and it irritated Marco Rubio. We don't know how much. Brazil's business diplomacy is working alongside its professional diplomatic corps, also irritating Marco Rubio. This situation is complex and may indicate something quite solid. Marco Rubio's candidacy to succeed Trump may be weakened at this moment, hence the desperation. Because the lack of approval in the Senate is a strong indication that a considerable portion of Republican senators are much more aligned with Vance than Rubio in the race to succeed Trump. That being said, I've been wondering for a few days now, we've already talked about this, about that famous red cap Trump war with the year of the next election 2 years from now. Why did he do that? Is it because he's signaling that he will be the candidate? I don't know. I think what he means with that cap is that he will remain president for the next 2 years. There's no point in the Republican Party leadership trying to create a successor while he's still there. That successor doesn't seem to be Marco Rubio. That fact seems very clear.
Another angle here, what do you expect in terms of a response from Brazil's foreign ministry? We know that a basic concept of international relations, so to speak, is reciprocity. Lula has mentioned this several times over the past year, especially since the big tariff increase. And we also know that it's hard to apply reciprocity effectively when you're dealing with a superpower, whether it's China, the United States, especially those two. But what do you expect in terms of a response? From Brazil's foreign ministry, from the federal government, what do you think would be appropriate, and what do you think should actually happen in practical terms?
Look, first and foremost, Brazil's foreign ministry should convey the response through diplomatic channels, and that's what will happen. It won't be through the media. I suspect that we won't have any bombastic statements from any representative of the Brazilian government. We will follow the same caution as with the tariffs, exactly the same. The first caution was so effective that they were kind of revoked, even by the Supreme Court, but in any case revoked. Trump considered a series of actions. I suspect that this move by Rubio happened because Brazilian diplomacy is working well. If it weren't working well, he wouldn't need this. That's obvious. So therefore, if it's working well, let's use a very Brazilian expression, we don't change a winning team. And I think the tone of Brazilian diplomacy is being quite effective. And I think it will continue in that same direction, on that same path, because we're not interested in any confrontation. Confrontation only interests those who have problems, and the one who has problems is Donald Trump, not Brazil. On the contrary, Brazil has solutions.
Another perspective. But then, what is the limit of this process? Because if they keep going, as everything indicates, all right, the argument was that the official position, at least of Trumpism, is that Brazil is restricting the freedom of expression of American citizens, that there is a whole issue related to unfair practices because of PIX. That's what he points out as the most obvious, so to speak. Now, it's very clear that there is an issue, let's say, of immediate interference in our sovereignty, and that the ultimate goal is to destabilize the presidential election. So, it even seems to me that this diplomatic and more cautious approach, which requires more care, is indeed more appropriate, but it may become insufficient at some point because it depends on the level of the provocation. How far will this go? That's my question.
That's exactly what good diplomatic practice is. The diplomat's job is to measure exactly the tone of the response, the meaning of the response, right? For example, right? Among the things you brought up that I think are fundamental, for example, PIX, right? PIX. Brazil received unprecedented support for PIX, right? The director of the International Monetary Fund, attention, The IMF, whose majority of votes are American, most of the financial support is American. He said that the Brazilian PIX is an example for the whole world and in no way threatens the dollar. But it's not me saying this or you saying it or Minister During, it's the IMF. Other American banks said the same thing. So it doesn't make sense. As for the pressure regarding freedom of speech, what they're trying to do is interfere with the Brazilian judiciary. What I'm saying here, I can't hurl any insult or make any accusation against anyone without being held responsible for what I'm saying. That's obvious. Other people's honor is as valuable as any other asset. You can't use, no matter what means of communication, to attack someone else's honor. This has been in the Brazilian Penal Code for 150 years. This isn't something new. So now, just because you've changed the way this attack happens, it doesn't mean you're not breaking the law. Sorry, that's not how it works. So, it's not freedom of speech. I can't just call anyone a thief or anything else. I need to prove what I'm saying first. Right? Even more so, I can't hurl insults at anyone, no matter who it is. This happens every single day, every moment, spread by bots. Everyone knows that. Right? Brazilian law, when this exceeds minimal limits, it comes into play because someone else's honor was attacked. That doesn't mean we're restricting his rights, we're regulating it. That's not to mention much worse things, right, about social rights. Just one is enough, right? Pedophilia. Thinking that you have to leave social networks absolutely free is playing with something you shouldn't play with, right? By the way, the most developed countries are exactly following this path. Look at what's happening with the European Union, following the path of regulation in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, because the risk is real. So somehow you ask that here in Brazil there be no limit for the partners of Trump's candidacy, because I can't deny that they were partners. All 6 of them were there on Inauguration Day. The 6 biggest American big tech companies were there on Inauguration Day. That's unprecedented. This has never happened in American history. No sector has ever stood by the anointed president. All of them had, let's say it clearly, the decency not to do that because it looks bad. That decency was set aside, and they went there and showed everyone that they were the foundation of Trump's candidacy and Trump's inauguration. Trump is grateful and says that they shouldn't be subject to any kind of control here in Brazil. The Brazilian Supreme Court, obviously our Supreme Federal Court, obviously dismissed that advice, right? And acted against it by following the law. That's all, right? So therefore, it's going to be very difficult for us to go back or reverse anything regarding this process, right? Is this going to cause more unrest, more discontent? Yes, it will. Why is this unrest, this discontent so strong? Because we have an election in October, right? And it's clear that social media has a huge influence on the electoral process and needs to be subject to some kind of control, right? So this is still under discussion in Brazil. But what's really getting stronger is exactly this control, this American pressure for there to be no control. And it's clear that we have to ask the simplest question in the world. Who benefits from this? Right? It's clear that there's a candidate who is interested in attacking the other without major consequences. So that's obvious. It's the candidate who is, quote unquote, lower in the polls. So that's well known and everyone knows it. So therefore, in some way, this benefits that candidate more.
Again, and at this point, this is already openly in the public debate. It's not even speculation anymore, okay? People are considering whether there's a possibility that Donald Trump might eventually not recognize Lula's victory, questioning the legitimacy of the election, the integrity of the voting machines, all that talk that Trumpism itself used in the United States. From the perspective of international relations, what would be the possible consequences if Trump doesn't recognize it? And if this could, that's the question I want to hear your thoughts on. If this could generate similar reactions, for example, from Javier Milei, it seems clear to me that it could, but also from other right-wing leaders in South America and Latin America at this moment. How do you assess that?
Look, I suspect you know that everything in life has its limits. And I honestly suspect that financial interests, the wallets of American businessmen, will carry weight. We all know that the most sensitive part of a human being is their wallet. Taking an action like this would mean putting Brazil directly, let's be very honest, in China's lap. This is of no interest whatsoever to many sectors of American society. And I'll repeat something very sensitive. This is of no interest whatsoever to the American military. They share the security of the South Atlantic with Brazil. If anyone thinks this isn't important, please think about World War II, when we didn't have all the technology we have today, right? If anyone thinks this is trivial, think about the fact that, for the first time in history, we hosted in Rio de Janeiro, a month and a half ago, the largest American aircraft carrier, the Nimitz, with a maneuver with the Brazilian Navy, with joint command, something that had never happened before. Notice that Brazil, at the height of the tariff crisis, received the helicopters it had bought from the United States, but that had not yet been delivered. At the height of the tariffs, the American military gave the go-ahead, the first 4 arrived, and then the other 8 Guaibas arrived. Something that the rest of Latin America doesn't have. In other words, right, I think a move this rash won't fly. First, second. Such an impulsive attitude like this. The Brazilian election, even the second round, comes before November 4th. The tensions will be very high, and in some way, this would mainly harm Trump, especially because of everything it would signal in terms of room for Chinese action. I don't really believe in that, only because of the sequence of events it could trigger.